Let's talk about race. What do you think when you hear that word? What comes to mind for you? What emotions does it evoke for you? Americans seem to think about race or a race as something that's inevitable, as an unchanging part of the natural world, or even something ordained by God. But it's not. Race is a myth. The concept is socially constructed. Race has no standing of any kind as a scientific concept, and it's not biological. Even though race is a socially constructed concept, racial ideology is quite normative in society. So, for example, consider this sentence: Americans are still prejudiced against blacks. Now, that sentence may not be true, but for many, the meaning is perfectly clear in a quick and casual reading that there's prejudice against blacks. Now consider this sentence: Americans still earn less money than whites. Did something happen? Did you pause for a second and think about the meaning of the sentence? If so, that's because the conventional use of the word Americans generally assumes white or a white point of view. American is a linguistic cover. It's a cover term that makes the first sentence grammatically and socially correct, and the second sentence initially kind of confounds because Americans in that sentence is a linguistic term for groups of color. Racial ideology is how we've been taught to think about race. James Green puts it this way: racial logic expresses a concern, both linguistic and psychological, with orderliness and the need to preserve and enforce order. Orderliness is constructed around notions of descent, exclusiveness, privilege, and most especially notions of moral purity. Kind of weighty, huh? Yeah, well, this definition helps us to understand the function of race in society. See, race is an American idea about who belongs where in society. It impacts opportunities for employment, housing, quality of education. The notion of race, connected with skin color, has very real implications for racial minorities. Racial minorities are overrepresented in poverty statistics, social welfare services, and contacts with law enforcement, just to name a few. Race is one of the social categories that individuals are placed in, and moral evaluations are often made about them based on this one identity characteristic. No one is a member of a race simply because of the amount of skin pigmentation, or the size or shape of their nose, or their eyes, or texture or color of their hair. When we make sense of these physiological features, we're expressing a perversiveness in devising social categories and then sticking individuals into them and making moral evaluations. But racial attitudes still persist, even though race is a biological myth. We've had in our past, and we continue to have, objections to things like interracial dating, relationships, and marriage. And even today, many of our communities remain segregated, despite laws enforcing segregation changing decades ago. These have always been based on seeming naturalness of racial divisions. The residual effects of racializing people created racism. Race does not exist, but racism is very real. So what is racism? Edward Bonasilva defines it this way: racism is about practices and behaviors that produce a racial structure, a network of social relations and social and political, economic, and ideological levels that shapes the life's chances of various races. Bonasilva says this structure is responsible for the production and reproduction of systemic racial advantages for some and disadvantages for others. So just how we think about people based on one identity characteristic, the color of our skin, has advantages for some and disadvantages for others. Racism has a long history in the United States, and its impact can be found in every facet of education, business, employment opportunities, encounters with the police, media portrayals, and just day-to-day life. Stop and frisk laws that are more heavily concentrated in communities of color that result in higher rates of police contact just for being in the community. Disparate sentencing in criminal justice. For example, in 2017, the Washington Post reported Black men who commit the same crime as white men receive federal prison sentences that are, on average, nearly 20% longer, according to a new report, Sentencing Disparities, from the United States Sentencing Commission. These disparities were observed after controlling for a wide variety of sentencing factors, including age, education, citizenship, weapons possession, and prior criminal history. According to a Pew Research survey, more than 4 in 10 Americans say the country hasn't made enough progress toward racial equality. About 6 in 10 Americans, or 58%, say that race relations in the United States are bad, and few of those see them even improving. Some key findings in a nationally represented survey of 6,637 adults conducted online January 22nd to February 25th, 2019, found this. Many Americans say it's now more common for people to express racist or racially insensitive views. More than 4 in 10 say it's more acceptable. Blacks are more likely than other groups to say their race has had negative impact on their ability to get ahead, while whites are most likely to say that their race helped them. Majorities of Black and white adults say Blacks are treated less fairly than whites in dealing with police and by the criminal justice system. Majorities of Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians say they have experienced discrimination because of their race or ethnicity. When asked about specific situations they may have experienced because of their race or ethnicity, Blacks are considerably more likely than whites, Hispanics, or Asians to say that people have acted as if they were suspicious of them. People have acted as if they weren't smart. They've been treated unfairly by an employer in hiring, pay, or promotion, or they've been unfairly stopped by police. Hispanics and Asians are more likely than whites to say that each of these have also happened to them. Asians are more likely than any other group to say that they've been subject to slurs or jokes because of their race or ethnicity. And in turn, more whites than Blacks, Hispanics, or Asians say that people have assumed that they were prejudiced. 45% of whites have had this particular experience. For Hispanics, skin color is associated with experiences with discrimination. So maybe you've heard people say there's only one race, the human race. And that's true, very accurate. Perhaps you've heard people say, I don't see color. Well, the information in the Pew Research shows that people do see color, and they make meaning of it. One way to explain the experiences of the Pew Research participants is by understanding bias. In general, a bias is a preference or values. They're things that influence and they shape us, experiences that might influence our decision making, and they often expose our values or a value base. So in general, biases are preferences and there are values, and they're not inherently bad. But if we have biases against other people, they can become problematic. A bias becomes problematic when we make decisions about others that are based on our values or our stereotypes or our prejudices. When our decisions impact others, biases can cause one to have prejudices in favor of or against a person or a group compared with another one. Usually, it's considered unfair. Our biases can impact the lives of others. Therefore, we need to decrease the potential for bias. The way to do that is to become aware of our biases and work toward expanding our knowledge about others so that we do not stereotype or prejudge. Once you have an awareness that racial injustice exists, it's important to learn about anti-racism work and practice anti-racism. This is the way that we'll be able to move past our biases, move past racism, and become more anti-racist as a society. Anti-racism is the practice of identifying, challenging, and changing the values, structures, and behaviors that perpetuate systemic racism. A person who practices anti-racism is someone who works to become aware of how racism affects the lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. A person who practices anti-racism is also someone who understands how racism is systemic. It's not just our own personal opinions and our attitudes. It's embedded in our systems, and it has become part of many foundational aspects of society throughout history. Racism can be manifested in both individual attitudes and behaviors, as well as formal and unspoken policies and practices within institutions. And so there's a difference between individual racism, a person's own thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, prejudices, and stereotypes about others, and institutional racism, where those thoughts are carried over into the institution, into school, into work, a person's job, law enforcement, or a hiring manager, or many other ways, right? So when our prejudices carry over into our institutions, it becomes institutional racism because it impacts the ways and the practices of the institution. If we're going to move forward together, once we understand what racism is and how it impacts people, we must act to expand choices and opportunities for all people with special regard for those who are vulnerable or disadvantaged or oppressed, for those who are exploited. We have to advocate for programs that demonstrate cultural competence. It's important to learn about each other, to understand our biases, and be ready to expand our views, to challenge some of our presuppositions, to challenge our stereotypes. We must advocate for programs that demonstrate cultural competence. We have to act to prevent and eliminate domination and exploitation and discrimination against those who have marginalized identities. We also should promote policies and practices that demonstrate respect for differences and support the expansion of cultural knowledge and resources. For decades, individuals and organizations have supported federal legislation that would address systemic racism. And more recently, we're seeing more organizations and more people do the same. More and more people are vocalizing support to expand legislation that will address systemic racism, including police reform. There are devastating and long-term consequences of racial injustice on the mental and physical health of individuals. And so, if we're going to move forward together and we're going to pursue justice, then we have to understand that justice demands that we pay attention to social structures as well as outcomes, that we pay attention to fair procedures, including the application of the law, that we distribute resources in society in a way that help to overcome the inequities to ensure equal opportunity, that we're ensuring equity and empowering people in decision making. Justice is really about targeting disadvantaged groups to ensure that they have the opportunity to experience all that the environment has to offer. And it often requires creating access to additional resources and accessing adequate support systems. What does racial justice look like? It looks like representation. It looks like laws that don't disadvantage you because of who you love. It looks like having full benefits of marriage and partnership, even if the person you love is the same sex or gender as you. It looks like equal pay for doing the same work. It looks like not being stereotyped or stigmatized because you have an accent or because of your skin color or religion. We each have a role in creating the places we want to exist. It's our civil right and our duty to confront injustice and work toward dismantling oppressive and unjust systems.